I want to welcome all of you once again to our third summer Bible study. And we are going to continue what we've done the last 2 weeks, is to get an overview of Scripture based on my father's book, manuscript, Gateway to God's Word. He wrote back in 1984. And so that's been in our on our website and also in our daily e-news this past year. So it's really helpful to see things from a larger point of view, to kind of put things together that way. And so glad you're with me in this. And so we're going to continue where we left off last week. Anyone remember where we left off?
We've done 2 out of 3.
Okay. All right. And we had, if you remember, we had, who was the first pioneering person? It was Moses.
Moses.
And then we were just getting into talking about David after we had gone through a lot of the assured dates of the Bible and history, kind of placing these stories in the history of the world. And so we moved into David, and I'm going to try to share my screen, and let me just do so now. And I will get this so we can all see it better. Let's just go to play and start. And I'm going to move through these quickly to get to, this is just an overview of what we've done. Quickly, watch. Okay. And Moses burning bush. Then we had the covenant at Mount Sinai. And here we are. So I am going to begin with that. We looked at David the king, just started talking about him. We talked about him as being one who had stories about him, often like Washington and Lincoln, their childhood stories, whether they were true or not. We have the same kind of sense going on with David and Goliath, one of the great stories that most of us know by heart. We have the statue of David, of course, and he was a musician as well. God-fearing king. His name meant leader or chief, most likely not a proper name. No one else in the Bible has that name except David. It's really pretty amazing. So many Davids in our culture, but that was the only one we really know about. And then we talked about Israel, Hebrew, and Jew, the differences between them, just to make sure we're clear on where they came from, those words. And he was a talented kingdom builder, Hebrew chieftain. If you know what Hebrew goes back to, Hebrew, all those people who are outcast in society, as you see there. And so David was a Hebrew chieftain, and very important to remember that. That's where he came from. Military man, outstanding ability. And then he found himself at Jerusalem. And I was always astounded, like I mentioned last week, 1,300 by 325 feet. The original outline of Jerusalem was only there. And it's stunning for me to think that. And then he established a kingdom where justice reigned. He tried to, but the kingdom grew too much. It was not what the Torah law was based on. It was based on neighbors talking to neighbors and in villages and small groups of people. And it was too hard to administer. And so he had some problems with that. And justice began to fail. And probably not only because David could not work out the technical problems, but also David was a flawed man, like we all are, and flawed person. And so we have to look at that as well. And so that's why the main reason justice wavered was because David moved away from the covenant with Moses, and they began to organize their lives not with that covenant that Moses made. God will be our people and we'll be God's people. God will be our God and God will be God's people. But that it now got the kingdom involved with that. And the monarch had a lot more power, could do anything that monarch wanted to, and God was bound to that protection. So that's where we left off last week, everybody. I just wanted to race through that so you kind of get a little sense of the context here. And let's just start here. Any questions though about David before we go any more? Just any thoughts about that?
Well, Harry, it's Bill. If you're moving on from David, I need to interject to say that I served a church in southeastern Wisconsin as the pastor. The church was Presbyterian, connected to the Welsh Methodist tradition, which was pretty much Presbyterian. And I learned there that Saint David is the patron saint of Wales. So on St. David's Day, the first Sunday in March, we had to be sure and sing Welsh hymns that day for St. David's Day.
You know, I thought you first met whales like in the ocean. So that was pretty cool.
Actually, outside of Waukesha, where I was, there was a town called Wales, Wisconsin, no H.
You know, nice connection, Bill. Thank you for that. All the Welsh part of this thing.
Yeah, put that in your liturgical calendar so we can be sure and sing Welsh hymns the first Sunday in March.
First Sunday in March. Thank you, Bill. Remind me in 2022.
Hey, Bill,
Okay.
name one Welsh hymn.
Well, we sing them without paying too much attention to the compositions of those hymns. But I could name two different texts, if I could just think about it quickly, two different texts to the same tune. I'll look it up and let you know by the end of the hour.
Oh, good. Yeah, find a hymnal real quick. Yeah. Okay. Well, David, we're going to just end up, you know, a few more slides with David. Maybe this is the last one, I'm not sure. And remember, you know, we have a lot of years from when David lived to now, and we always seem to lift up people, you know, and kind of forget about flaws and just shroud them with all sorts of amazing things that they did. And so we'd have that tendency with David. We remember him as a God-fearing king. You know, he worshiped Yahweh along with the people and so forth. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, enshrined it as a central object of worship for the Israelite people. Wasn't that wonderful? He's such a religious man to do that, but there was really more to it than that. He was trying to make Jerusalem the religious as well as the political capital of the country. And to do that was to bring all those symbols into Jerusalem. So he was shrewd, but also, as they would always say, God-fearing king, right? So he established the ark and the priesthood, official shrine, and he did that to bind the loyalties of the tribes of Israel to Jerusalem. And that had such a far-reaching response to it. And they gave their allegiance then to David, the king of Israel. And then in rejoicing, new psalms were composed for liturgical use, and old ones were gathered from all portions of the empire for the celebrations of the temple. Must have been quite a time. Must have been quite a time. Some of the psalms, of course, were ascribed to David as well, as we know him in history as the one who was a musician as well. So any thoughts about David? We begin to get a sense of what's happened from Moses, that covenant of Moses, to what David did to get an empire going, to add to the number of empires that were going on in that ancient world, one after the other. And then, of course, Israel became one of those empires. And problems happen when you have empires. But we're seeing the struggle now, beginning to have the struggle of leadership, of how we run an empire, run a country, and still try to make it, a place where God is central. Remember, I said last week that the word Israel might mean, the L is, for God, is let God rule. And that might be at least one of the names of Israel, one of the definitions of Israel. And David kind of brought that to a different place where he brought the king into ruling. So here we are. Any more thoughts about? I can't see you now with this on, so if you have anything to say, just pipe up and join the conversation. Okay, well, we've done 2 of the 4 pioneering persons, Moses and David, and now Elijah the prophet. The one that could be a prototype of a prophet, the one who challenged the policies of King Ahab, and you see the dates there. We're now going a little back in time. We were dealing with, no, I'm sorry, we're going forward in time. Just after David, then there was Solomon, and then there were sons of Solomon, and things were starting to not look as good even as in David's time. So here is a painting of Elijah. One of the great stories of Elijah is his confrontation with the prophets of Baal. Some people say Baal, it could be Baal. One of the gods, powerful gods back at that time. So here it is, Elijah the prophet. I'm just going to go down some of these points here. This heresy, this pagan heresy began in the time of Solomon, the son of David, and then espoused by Ahab's own father, King Omri of Israel, the marriage of throne and altar. Here it is, one of the great heresies back in the Old Testament, throne and altar. And it happened because, well, you got to deal with other kingdoms and treaties and trying to get economies going. And if you can make some connection with some other country, then marry into it. And so that's what happened with Ahab. He married a daughter of the Sidonian priest, King Ethbaal. And we now know not the father, but we know well the daughter. Her name has come down to our own culture to this day, being a Jezebel. And we'll find out more about what Jezebel is all about and why that name has stuck through the years. Ahab, relatively tolerant in matters of religion, but Jezebel was not. Look at her name and her father's name. There's a Baal or a Bel at the end of it. And that always means they're named after that god Baal. And so Jezebel wanted to live up to that name, her name. And so she did so rather strikingly. She began to persecute the priests and worshipers of Yahweh, and she wiped out worship and worshipers of Israel's God as far as she could within her power. The lands where the Baals were supreme, the king considered himself not only the primary political officer of the state, but also the nation's chief spokesperson for God. See, you're seeing the change now, seeing the transition from Moses now to what Ahab's doing. In other words, the king was the absolute ruler, high priest as well as king, and anyone who attacked the policies of the king was in effect attacking God. Any comments on this so far? Any ways to bring our own cultural situation to play with anything that I just read off on these slides?
Has to be some reaction to this. The parallels with things that are going on between church and state these days are becoming more and more obvious. And I guess I won't get too much more specific than that, but just to kind of draw attention to the fact that this is the beginning of a long-term tradition that continues to today. The confusion of who is the light of the world, God, Jesus, or an earthly ruler who somehow out of ego ascends to the position of supreme authority.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Bob. Right. Other thoughts, anybody? Other thoughts? Yeah, as I read, yeah, go ahead.
That concept was I think very common in the ancient world. The pharaohs of Egypt had a similar position, I believe, and the Assyrian kings and so forth. They were religious leaders as well as secular leaders.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it was it was the, the pre, it was the separation of the priesthood and the rulership that was unusual in those days.
Yeah, right. And isn't it amazing it started so far back? That we see the results of it today. We've seen it through history. We've seen leaders think that they're God. We still have that going on. We know that got mixed up a lot with kings in the past and queens, and we even have had recent experience with somebody who thought that he was a supreme ruler type or a wannabe type, and so we always have to caution ourselves. But it's always good to know where some of this may have come from and the struggles that have been going on for 3,000 years with that issue. And so so let's move on and see what else we might learn from this. And we can trace this back to 1 Kings 18 if you ever want to look at this story. But Elijah comes from this little village Tishbe in Gilead, east of the Jordan River, and look at what his name means. My God is Yahweh. What a name to have when you're dealing with a Jezebel, whose name is all about Baal. And remember, as always, every name, almost as far as I can see in the Bible, every name indicates something about that person. A name was powerful. And, imagine if we were to meet somebody and in English, we would hear the name is my God is Yahweh. Every time we say that name, we are getting a sense of who that person is. And that's what Elijah was. Now, anyone know about droughts at all? Anyone here? Yeah. Okay. Back in Ohio, I didn't know about droughts. I heard about them. We had them once in a while. We had more a sense we had too much rain. Drive outside of Cleveland down in the farm country, and all we see is just fields filled with water. And so the Great Lakes region does not know much about droughts, but Israel did. We know droughts. Israel did. And they were experiencing it during this time, one of the worst droughts in its history, 3 years without rain. And so imagine what it was doing to the people, to the crops, to livelihoods, to, just survival. And that Elijah, notice how he does this, announced that the drought had been caused by the policies of King Ahab. Now, anyway, does this ring a bell to anybody with recent things that people, like pastors, probably not from our strain, but from other parts of Christianity, have tried to attribute different, things like droughts or earthquakes or tsunamis to what's happening with God's will. And so we've heard of that. Tsunami, I think somebody way back when said that was because of something that the Japanese were doing. And, some earthquake was because of what people were, so we hear that still.
And I think Katrina was blamed on the homosexuals in New Orleans.
There you go. And we'll just spread it out, not only in New Orleans, but let's move it further now, and yeah, exactly right, Alice. It's easy to do it, and we just can count on it almost to read about somebody spouting off that, that God was upset with something and so causes these things. So
I'm going back now. I'm remembering time that I've spent with the Presbyterian disaster assistance. And when it came to interviewing pastors who wanted to come into a disaster area, such as the attack on New York City, one of the questions that was asked is, do you know what caused this? And anyone who came in with that kind of an answer, that it was caused by this or that on the human level, whether it be intermarriage or gay rights or whatever, was canceled out of the program.
Great story, Bob. Isn't that interesting how this is so much a part of what we even do to deal with issues in the world? We have to find ourselves taken aside. Oh my goodness. And And of course, what we found out is during the pandemic, and we knew beforehand, is that when we don't pollute the earth and calm down a little bit and just kind of let things be, the earth starts to recover. So it's not particularly, it's not God doing all this, it's us doing it to the earth in many ways. So keep all this in mind as we go through this story.
Yeah, I'm thinking as well of the contemporary clergy or governors who are asking to pray for rain. That suggests perhaps two things, at least one of two. First of all, God doesn't know what's going on. And secondly, that he doesn't care.
Yep. Yeah. And we get mixed up with all of that thinking so much, in our culture, in our lives. So it's really interesting then to read this story, to hear about this story. You can go to 1 Kings 18 and read it firsthand. But of course, when Elijah announces this drought that's caused by the policies of King Ahab, that gets people stirred up. The prophets of Baal are very upset about this, and it challenges them and their power, of course. And so, especially since their God was the God of fertility. And so Elijah still maintains that Yahweh has authority over all of the land, over all spheres of life. And all of a sudden, the stage is set. So let's see what happens next. Here we are. Elijah challenging the prophets of Baal. You see some drawing, some artwork there. A lot of movement in the left-hand drawing there. And you see more of what's going on as artists try to depict what happens when you have to have this challenge here. And let's just see more about what's happening. And it goes on to 1 Kings 19. In fact, we'll just say that he won. I won't go through the whole story. If you read 18, it turns out that he won. There's all sorts of theatrics as I move back here. And, and the Baal prophets are doing all sorts of dancing around and so forth, and nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, lightning strikes, and this poor animal on the altar there, and rain starts to fall, and it's just a marvelous sight, and a marvelous way of confirming who Yahweh is back in those days. And it must have been quite a victory, but not long enjoyed. Hardly had he won this fiery victory when he was forced to flee from Israel. Jezebel always shows up in these stories, vowed to destroy Elijah and all he stood for in Israel. So here we go. Here's another story about Elijah. After that great victory, isn't it always true that we have some great victory, but it doesn't last long? There's always some other challenge. Somebody else is upset with what happens, and so they are after Elijah. 40 days and 40 nights. Does that 40 again? Always think of 40 as some lifetime duration, as some generation time. 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days, 40 nights. It's a long time. And he goes to the south, and it's the same number, of course, 40 in the wilderness, and Elijah clearly retracing the steps of that journey. So, on a mountain, like Moses this time, like Moses experienced at Sinai, Elijah experienced an earthquake, a wind, and fire. And now, right then, I just want to stop because every time I see earthquake, wind, and fire, I think back to the 70s of the rock group Earth, Wind, and Fire. So I start humming tunes of theirs in my mind as I'm going through this story. So I just got to get that out of my mind. I'm just going to let you know that happens to me. And so the traditional phenomenon that links Yahweh to this sacred mountain, earthquakes and wind and fire. Remember what Moses was experiencing, what they saw from down below when he was talking to Moses, God talking to Moses and getting those 10 commandments dealt with. But amazingly this time, God was in none of these, and there was that still small voice, that awesome silence. And in that silence, there is a complaint from Elijah. I only am left, and I am no better than my fathers. And no longer he had the strength to stand up to the paganizing forces surrounding him in his nation. How many times do we come in our own life into the lives of leaders and the people saying, you know what, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I thought I could, but I can't match up to what, my fathers and mothers did before us. They must have been great people to do it. I'm not in that line. And so, done. And how often do we see that with leaders, those that we often admire? They sometimes just say, I can't do it anymore. Do you have any thoughts about that one? Am I just speaking out of turn? But we see that too often, or maybe I feel that at times myself, saying, gun violence prevention. What's going on with that? And how come we can't seem to get moving? Is it worth working on? Is it all those kind of issues? Pick an issue, and you may have those same feelings.
I just learned this week of a pastor who left a church that in this case, he was serving. He was planning to leave, but left earlier than he had hoped because he couldn't take it anymore.
Yep.
I think in this case, he was feeling less support and more contentiousness, and said, I don't need this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't need this. 1, 2, 3, 5, 4 words that we probably all said at one point, maybe sometimes even recently. I don't need this. And I put on a fifth one, anymore. And so we're seeing this with Elijah. I'm always astounded that these stories always bring something to our contemporary life that we can identify with. Even Elijah, the ultimate prophet, stood up to the prophets of Baal, is being chased by Jezebel. How many people are being chased by Jezebels? Or we just can't get away from them. How many Jezebels are out there? And we don't have any strength left. A quick story, just as you mentioned that pastor story, Bill, a quick story about, it may not apply, but it's kind of interesting though. What happens to pastors. My dad served a church in Granville, Ohio, his first church out of Yale Divinity School back in 1951. It's an abolitionist church, had a great long history story, storied history. It's where Denison University is in Granville, Ohio. And there was a pastor back in the founding pastor, I think it may have been, back in the 1800s. It was founded back in the early, like 1803 or something. The pastor was there for 49 years. He wanted to retire after 50, and the church kicked him out after 49 years. Now, I mean, you just want to make it a nice number, and he's kicked out after all those years of ministry. Anyway, that's just, things happen that way. I only am left, Elijah says, and I'm no better than my fathers. Now, what does God do? God doesn't say, oh, I know. Oh, poor child. Thank you so much. Just be on your way, and we'll just find somebody else. God says instead, get off your knees. Go back to Israel. There are 7,000 of you left, and you have never bowed the knee to Baal. Go with your message and uphold them in their faith. So we're never left off the hook. God always seems to come back saying, get off your knees. Tired of this talk? There's still people around, 7,000 of you. You can do it. Come on now. Uphold them in their faith. So anyway, that's always a better ending in my book, at least, that we don't walk away just shaking our head. Any responses to that one at all?
It kind of reminds me of the current feedback that we're hearing once in a while in response to saying our thoughts and prayers are with you.
Huh.
our thoughts and prayers are with those other people who suffer from gun violence or from natural disaster. Our thoughts and prayers, and people more often now are saying, get off your knees and do something about those thoughts and prayers.
Isn't that a nice transition?
Yeah.
Isn't that a nice way of doing that now? Because, it's to the point where we cannot be on our knees anymore, and that with that position of saying I'm the only one left and no one's around and no one, get off your knees. You always wonder how God actually may have, how Elijah may have heard God speak. What words? How did God really sound? Who knows? But that's how I look at it. Come on, people, come on. Let's just get going again.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's like get off the cross. We need the wood.
Yeah, right. That's right. We have things to do. Come on now. Yeah, no more suffering like that. We got work to do. Anyway, it's a great story that way. And so one last story of the other story we have of Elijah. Ahab is still around. He wants a vineyard because it's real close to his palace, so he can expand his house. He just wants to take it from Naboth and his sons, and they refuse. But Jezebel, there again is Jezebel, and eventually they were put to death because they refused. It went through all sorts of legal stuff and so forth, but Jezebel was pulling strings. And so Elijah stands in the vineyard and pronounces sentence upon Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab, not being as strong a Baal person and fan as Jezebel, repents, but Jezebel does not. And Jezebel, now this is pretty graphic out there in the Bible, cast from the palace window, and the horses trampled her body into the ground. Whew, that's what it says. I just quoted it here. And so Jezebel is taken care of. Ahab repents. Elijah now stands in a vineyard. What a great symbol. Yahweh now still becomes the God of Israel. Our behavior is accountable to all the living, and accountable to God. And this is the basic insight Elijah offers. The main religious problem of humankind is not atheism, but idolatry. Saw that throughout the stories of Elijah. He was always confronting idolatry. And no one ever was an atheist back then. There was a God they believed in somewhere. But idolatry, what kind of God do you believe in, and how you worshiping that God? So that's the final story for Elijah. 3 major stories of the prophet Elijah, which became, kind of a prototype of other prophets to come. Any final thoughts on Elijah before we move on to the 4th pioneering person?
That
What do you think about the labeling of some contemporary women as Jezebels? We hear that term being applied.
Right, you do, right. Well, now you know some of the stories that are behind that reference. But it's still around us today, which I'm always surprised at, but we always have biblical imagery and names that still come to us, and we still use them, even though they may have lost some of their meaning, or they may have changed their meaning through the years. We don't know what the original meaning was. At least now we know a little bit more about Jezebel, perhaps, and hopefully more about Elijah. Yeah, Bobby has something?
Yeah, it's just that insight attributed to Elijah. You pointed out there was no atheism probably back in those days, so you have to question that. My point is, the main religious problem of humankind is not atheism, but idolatry. That's a fairly recent quote by some, and I don't recall who said it, but having heard it within the last year or so, yeah. I'm saying, yeah, right on. That's still the case.
Okay.
And there are probably more meanings to idolatry in our lives than statues. I mean, or if that's what they're referring to, just that we have to define it somehow for ourselves too, I guess.
Yeah, right. You know, what are our idols? You know, what do we put a lot of meaning to in our own life and our own culture? You know, and then you'll find that some are in statues, but other ones are just part of the, and we don't even know where it's there. And it's fun sometime to just talk about the idols in our culture. There are many. There are many gods with little g in our culture. And so we don't have the atheism as much because we believe in those idols. We give high meaning to them. So all of those kind of issues kind of flow around Elijah's ministry there. But what we have now for a fourth pioneering person is probably one you probably thought would happen. We have Jesus the Christ. Look at the picture. Look at the
Blind Jesus.
You know, have you ever seen this photo? This photograph? Anyone seen this painting before?
Grew up with it.
Grew up with it. Exactly right. This is then, you know, didn't it come? When did it show up in the 40s? I looked this up one time, the artist there, but whatever it was, it's been around for, you know, 80 years, perhaps, maybe longer. It's become kind of the symbol that's in people's minds because they've seen it so often. Shows up in classrooms, in churches.
Yeah, I always thought he came from Ohio.
Exactly right. Thank you for that. Well, you know, there are more images though. There we go. And the one on the left outside of our door in our church in Ohio, you open the door right to the left of the chancel and you see about a 6-foot painting of this. A reproduction of Jesus knocking on the door. It doesn't look like it's a door from Jesus' time. It looks like a door from, you know, the Renaissance times or, you know, whenever it was. So you've seen that one before, right? The one on the left, you know, is from the Orthodox Church. I'm sorry, the one on the right is from the Orthodox Church, you know, and some of these icons that are going on. So we, you know, we extend, but I tell you, this one on the left, that face looks eerily like the one we saw in the previous painting. And so you would reinforce it enough and you start thinking maybe that's true. Then the one on the right, maybe he doesn't look as much like he's an American. Maybe he starts to look a little more Eastern. Let's just see what else we come up with. Oh, wait a second. Now we have Jesus the Christ from a native standpoint, perspective on the left. And we have one from an Asian perspective on the right. There we are. And then we have one from an African perspective. And even look at this one. The one on the right is the same kind of picture we had earlier on, but now it's of a person of color. You know, so we have a lot of renditions. I had a friend at Yale Divinity School who she was from Sri Lanka. Her name was Nalini Jarasaria, and she was an artist, and she painted Christ as if it came from her own culture, and she painted other stories of Christ and other stories in the Bible. And if I had enough money to like to pay $250, I think was one of her paintings. If I had enough, I would have bought one. But luckily, right when I come into the church here in Santa Fe, when we start interviewing, you know, for me to become pastor here, what do I see on the wall in the Rendon room? I see one of her paintings. And it's a painting of, it's now in Ann Ladley's office upstairs in the CDC, you know, and so I felt at home. I felt like I had friends gathered around me, and people painting, and it was kind of new back in 1984, 83, to have Christ look something different than what we saw in the very first two paintings, but it's become more prevalent now, fortunately. Now let's just see how far it goes. So, yes, Jesus on the left, isn't that nice? Jesus with a gun and with a rifle. Jesus is used for so many different things anymore, for so many different causes. Somebody told me one time as we're in the midst of a debate at the I think it was city council about some gun ordinance that we were trying to support to reduce guns in Santa Fe, and somebody said, God, Jesus would have had a gun if they were available back then, but that Jesus would have shot to wound and not to kill, and that was the difference. And so I just was always kind of astounded by that statement. But you can see, why would somebody actually do a painting with Jesus holding a rifle? Well, we know full well why. Jesus and a culture like that, they become intertwined, and people use Jesus for so many causes. We saw that on January 6th, and we've seen that so often before and since. Use Jesus as you want to support your cause. And then just on the right-hand side, just happened to come across this photograph of somebody with a Jesus, a tattoo, huge, a Jesus with thorns. So it's become part of our culture in so many different ways. Any responses to any of these paintings or photographs at all?
Well, if you go to a lowrider exhibit, frequently there'll be pictures of Jesus or many Christian symbols on their lowrider cars, and there they are, these big tough guys, and here's Jesus on their lowriders.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah, and Harry,
Yeah.
lots of prison inmates often have, tattoos of Mary or Jesus.
Yeah. Isn't that something? Right. And what I've come to understand, and people have told me this too, that, Jesus is still doing pretty well in our society. People still revere him. They still try to remember what he said. It gets distorted so often, but still the idea of Jesus is still very popular. People believe in that. It's just the ways that we respond to those ideas that get us in trouble. The churches are not anywhere as highly esteemed, those who profess to follow Jesus, as Jesus himself, and that's natural, of course, but we fall often way far behind. If we were to really focus in on what Jesus did, we wouldn't look like what we do, and we would look a lot differently, and we would not be as well as how do I put that? We would not be as comfortable, because we'd be out there espousing a lot of things that Jesus did, and we'd be getting into a lot more conflicts in our society. So all sorts of things start to float around when we mention the name Jesus, or if we have a Jesus tattoo that we wear around. I personally do not have tattoos, nor I don't think I would get that one just on my arm like that.
Before you came up with this slide, all the previous ones that showed the different cultural aspects and illustrations of Jesus, I was going to say that all of those are true.
Yeah, right. Until the last slide, we start to get into the culture, our culture, and to see what that means and how we like to take it to those lengths. Now, there's one more slide, and I have Bob to thank for this one. Bob, what is your image of Jesus? And Bob was nice enough, after I gave a sermon one time years ago on the laughing Jesus. Bob came back with the copy of a drawing he had in his, was it your office? Yeah, and I have it now. I'm looking at it right now. The drawing that Bob gave me is always here in the front of my desk here, next to my window. I can always look and see a laughing Jesus. This laughing Jesus, Bob, you want to say where it comes from?
Well, I got it out of Playboy magazine.
Yes, indeed. That's where it was. That's where it came from. They did an article on Jesus, and Harvey Cox was part of all that. As you see below his name, one of the great theologians from Harvard. And anyway, it got into the culture, right, Bob?
Yes.
Instead of that pensive looking up to the sky somewhere that we saw in that first painting from the 40s that we all know about, wouldn't it be something if we had an image of Jesus like this in our minds?
You know, it's kind of hard to attribute any kind of nationality to this particular drawing.
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right. You know, there's more of that. You aren't seeing him as purely, you know, Anglo-Saxon, American, Caucasian, you know, mainstream, whatever. There may be some other parts of him, people in him. What
And
do
he
you,
has good teeth.
good teeth? You know, that's a nice observation. The Messiah always needs a good dentist and a good, you know, a good flossing. We're glad for that part. Any other thoughts about these images of Jesus that we have as we're closing our time? Because next week we will spend our whole time, our last time with me teaching all about Jesus, his life, and his followers. And so it'll be a full Sunday next week, but I wanted to get these images out for us to ponder. But any other thoughts about this image of Jesus, these images of Jesus and what Jesus might mean to our culture or you today?
I think it's interesting that you get no physical description of Jesus in the Bible at
Right.
all.
Right.
I mean, that so well, the Gospels aren't big on physically describing people anyway, unless it's important to the story. For instance, Zacchaeus has to be unusually short so that he has to climb up a tree to be able to see Jesus.
Right.
But Jesus himself, the disciples, nobody is very rarely is anybody described, because that was not important, I don't think, to them.
Mm-hmm.
What Jesus looked like. What was important was what he said, what he did, and who he was.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Margaret. I would have just said the same thing. I appreciate those words because we don't have descriptions. And what do you think that somebody would have said in one of those Gospels or somewhere, and but what Jesus' face looks like, somewhere, how tall he was, or you know, was he this or they would have said something about him, and they don't. So it's left up to all these imaginations of artists through the years. But if you were to go to Palestine today, I would imagine if you were to look at a lot of Palestinians today, you might see then what Jesus may have looked like back then. And so we need to remember that. He was not one white man out of many Palestinians. He looked different. He was a Jew, lived in Palestine, and you would think that he would probably resemble the people that live in that part of the world. So let's all keep that in mind. But the amazing thing is that Jesus is universal as well. That Jesus can go across boundaries of nations and cultures and the color of people's skin, as my friend Nalini would paint, and as we saw there in the pictures of an African Jesus and an Asian Jesus and so forth. So let's keep those images in mind. I have this image of a laughing Jesus with me every day I come to the office. Thank you, Bob. And I like to remember that too, as that side of his humanity. And he was hearing a good story, you know, or saw an old friend, you know, from a distance and was welcoming him. Whatever those you can ascribe to that drawing there, I think we can. So it's 9:51 now. And I want to thank you for 3 weeks of a fun time together with Gateway to God's Word. And as I said, next week we'll continue for our last one on my part of it. We'll take July 4th off because it's July 4th. But we will come back on July 11th. Now, I'll just tell you what's happening in the future. It's been approved now that we will come back at 9:45 on a Sunday morning, and we'll most likely come back in person, but also stay online for those who can't make it. So we'll do a hybrid, but we'll be in the chapel on July 11th. Next week, we'll still be on Zoom. But on July 11th, back in the chapel, we'll have a big screen TV for those who will be coming in on Zoom. And we have it all worked out, right, CC? It'll be worked out by then how to do all that. It's already worked out with other meetings. And we'll have our class there. So anyway, those are my final words. And join us at 10 and join us at 11 o'clock, worship on the Triangle, in person, on the Triangle outside the sanctuary doors. what a delight to be with you. Thank you all so much. And we'll see you in some form, someplace soon.